The two-hander warrior is a real DPS build and it works. We're gonna be talking about why this build works, how to play it, and of course the trade-offs. Now if we take a look at the talents really quick, we are still gonna go Fury. Fury is bonkers broken, it will always be bonkers broken, arms just cannot keep up. Even with a long two-hander, Bloodthirst is gonna hit way harder than Mortal Strike every single time. And Flurry, 30% attack speed, and Death Wish, 20% damage. They will always be way too good to pass up. So even if you're two-hander, you gotta go Fury. Now let's talk about the actual talents. We're gonna take Cruelty for 5% free crit, of course. Then Unbridled Wrath is gonna be pretty much useless for you. You got a very slow weapon, you do not hit very often, and it's like a 40% chance to get one rage. It's pretty much useless. I recommend you take Demo Shout, because that way you can be like the DPS that keeps Demo Shout on the boss to help the raid out. I mean, I don't know, that's what I would do. You can take this one if you want for one rage, that's not gonna matter. You can do it, I'm not gonna do that. Then we are gonna take Battle Shout. Battle Shout is free attack power, really strong. Then we're gonna take Enrage here, obviously. We are gonna take a point in Death Wish, 20% damage, pretty much mandatory. Then we're gonna take 2 points in Execute. We're still gonna be executing. Even though Execute, I'm gonna explain that later in the rotation, Execute is actually weaker for a two-hander. That's one of the trade-offs. Then we're gonna take 2 points in Slam over here. We are not gonna use Slam very often unless you are Alliance, and we're gonna be talking about that in a minute. The Alliance are gonna get much more mileage out of Slam, and yes, the Horde is better for this build, that's another thing. Then we're gonna take Flurry over here, 30% attack speed when you crit, one of the best talents in the game, of course, more damage, more rage, more everything. And Bloodthirst, 45% of your attack power, that's gonna be your main ability. You wanna crank this thing every time you can crank it. It is way stronger than Mortal Strike, which is just weapon damage. Weapon damage is like 25% attack power scaling, just for a comparison. Very well, now we are gonna take 3 points in Rend, of course, because we wanna take deep wounds. Very important we take deep wounds, and also there is no debuff limit now, so that's cool. We are gonna take 2 points in Heroic Strike, and then we are gonna take 5 points in Tactical Mastery. Why are we gonna take Tactical Mastery? Because we are gonna be overpowering, and that's the main benefit of the two-hander build. Overpower, right here we're gonna take 2 points, obviously. 50% crit, it is pretty much a guaranteed crit for a warrior, this ability. Every time the enemy gets a dodge, you get this thing for 5 rage, it is basically free, and you do full weapon damage with a guaranteed crit. That's a 50%, actually a little more, 55 almost % weapon scaling when you multiply the crit and you multiply by Impale. So Overpower is gonna be your hardest hitting ability, especially, believe it or not, in low attack power situations, because it also has the base weapon damage on it. Since you hit with a super slow two-hander, a lot of your base weapon damage, and early on that's all you got really, because you do not have a lot of attack power, that's gonna be bonkers damage. And of course, Overpower guaranteed crit is gonna give you deep wounds. Every time you crit, you put 60% of weapon damage on the boss as a dot. And on top of that, Impale, 20% bonus damage to crit. Now, this is a little confusing on the wordings. It only affects the bonus damage, so it is actually 10%. Your crits are gonna hit 10% harder, but that's a 210% multiplier on your crits. Overpower is gonna always hit by 210% of what it's supposed to. That's broken, obviously broken. And we got 3 more points. Now, if you are Alliance, we are gonna take all the points in Slam, and that's gonna be level 60 for us. It is gonna make your Slam go from 1.5 seconds to 1 second. It's a casted ability and you gotta stand still, so it is not ideal. And also, hits by Slam reset your weapon swing timer, so that's more time. Like, say, for example, you got a weapon speed of 3, just for making up a number, and you hit an auto attack, and then you're 1.5 seconds after that, you do a Slam, you gotta wait 3 seconds again for the next auto attack. It goes all the way back to the start, so you gotta do it as soon as you end an auto attack, and that's of course gonna cut down your rage generation too, because that is less auto attacks when you cast it. The upside, of course, is you do full weapon damage in 1 second with this thing, so you can imagine a slow weapon, that's a lot of damage. Now, another quirky thing about Vanilla and Slam, an instant ability like Mortal Strike is normalized to a speed of 3.3. That means, because of course, the slower the weapon, the more you scale from attack power when you auto attack. But they normalized it so every weapon speed scales the same for the instant attacks. Like Mortal Strike, like Whirlwind, like Overpower. But Slam is not normalized. So if your weapon is slower than 3.3, like every single two-hander weapon ever, Slam is gonna do more damage than a Whirlwind, for example. So yeah, if you're Alliance, you're gonna be using Slam, that's gonna be your go-to. But if you are Horde, we are actually gonna take 1 less point in here, and we're gonna take 1 point in Anger Management. Now, the tooltip doesn't say it, but you get free rage every 3 seconds, you get 1 point of rage. And that's because your rotation is gonna be slightly different as a Horde warrior than Alliance. That's because obviously for Wind Fury, but we're gonna be talking about that in a minute. And there you go. Either this for Horde or this for Alliance, that's gonna be your build. Your stat priority is gonna be rather simple. First of all, you wanna get your hit cap, which is a flat 9%. That's the hard cap. If you get a weapon skill racial, that is a human or an orc, you know, the weapon and mace skill or the axe skill, in that case, you only need 6% hit. After that, you wanna get strength or attack power, of course, the equivalent. Now, the cool part about this build is that it works very well with or without high attack power, so that's really cool. Then we're gonna be taking critical strike or agility, and that's pretty much it. Now, the rotation is not that different from your normal dual wielding rotation, but it is different. Number one in the priority is gonna be overpower. Whenever you get an overpower proc, I got a really good overpower Wikora in the Discord, in the warrior channel, if you wanna keep track of that. Whenever you get a proc, you gotta go to battle stance and overpower. It does a lot of damage, it puts deep wounds on the target, it is just the best thing you can do. Then you wanna go back to berserker stance because you get 3% more crit and you get to use whirlwind, which is gonna be part of your rotation. But second in the priority is gonna be bloodthirst. Bloodthirst hits like a freaking truck, it will always hit really hard, so we're gonna be doing that. And after that is gonna go whirlwind. Now, even if you don't have a lot of crit, you are gonna definitely have excess rage on top of this, but you are not going to dump it with heroic strike. This is where the difference between the Alliance and the Horde comes in. If you are Horde, you're gonna be spamming hamstring. Why hamstring? Because every time you do a hamstring, you get a chance to get another overpower proc because the boss can dodge the hamstring, of course. And obviously, because every hamstring has a chance to procure Wind Fury. 20% to get a full auto attack for free, which is more rage, it is a lot of damage. So spamming hamstring is definitely the way to go to dump your rage. But if you still have excess rage on top of that, you are indeed going to slam. You wanna slam right away after you do an auto attack so you don't reset your timer, but slam is gonna be the last resort. Why are we not doing heroic strike as a two-hander? That's a very simple question. Because heroic strike doesn't generate any rage when you auto attack, and when your auto attack is slow and huge, that is a huge amount of rage that you're losing doing that, so it's not worth it. And that's why eventually dual wield fury is gonna outscale two-hander fury because of glancing blows. When you're fighting a boss, there is like a 40% chance that your attack is gonna do less damage than it's supposed to. That's called a glancing blow. It's like a anti-crit, so to speak. And if you do heroic strike, that cannot happen. But it costs you so much potential rage to do this on a two-hander that it is not something you can do. And that's why dual wield is eventually gonna do more damage. Eventually, not early on. However, if you are Alliance, you are just gonna do slam. You're gonna do overpower, bloodthirst, whirlwind, and slam. Now, slam will actually trigger your global cooldown and you do a 1 second slam. So if you are super capping on rage, rarely but it can happen, you might have to queue one heroic strike to dump it. It is not a great situation when that happens, and that's the main reason why Alliance is worse at the slam spec than the Horde, because the Horde can just spam hamstring and never worry about that. Once again, the cool part about being early on is that your gear is gonna be absolute garbage, and since your gear is absolute garbage, you are very rarely gonna be rage capping anyway. And that's the other reason that dual wield is gonna be two-handers. They can take more advantage of excess rage. Now in the execute phase, you're gonna be doing overpower. First of all, overpower is gonna beat anything you do. Second is gonna be bloodthirst, and you might ask me, Medina, why are you doing bloodthirst instead of just spamming execute? As you guys know, if you got more than 2000 attack power, bloodthirst is gonna hit harder than execute for the same amount of rage. But also with a two-hander, you always have either 0 rage or way more than 15 rage. It's better if you have like a little bit of rage and you just pop every single GCD. So overpower and bloodthirst are still gonna be a little more efficient. And yes, that is another advantage to dual wield, that they do have better execute phases. Now for another advantage, when it comes to the AoE rotation, you do way better AoE than a dual wielder, because first of all, whirlwind is gonna hit 4 targets and is weapon damage, two-hander is way more damage, and second, the same thing that was working against you you on Heroic Strike is actually working for you when you're cleaving. It costs the same amount of rage to do a cleave for a super big auto attack or for a super small auto attack. So you can actually get a lot more damage per rage by doing cleave when you get a two-hander instead of a one-hander. And your rotation for AoE is gonna be just whirlwind and cleave. And that's it, you should be dumping all your rage in that. Now, we can talk about the recommended weapons, and I think that should be a huge decision factor on whether you go two-hand or dual wield. I also made a guide for dual wield, by the way. Now, let's talk about the potential axes you can get. If you're an orc, you got the axe weapon skill. And actually, I think orc is like the best argument for two-hander because there is not a lot of good one-hander axes early on in the game. There is one axe in Onyxia, yeah, and that's pretty much it. The best axe that you can get is gonna be the Arcanite Reaper. Now this thing is really slow, it has really good DPS, and it kinda looks just super rad. It doesn't just look cool. You can make it with blacksmithing, so all you need is gold, and you can do it. So that's gonna be super accessible for everybody. You can also go for the Dreadforce Retaliator. It is not as good as the Arcanite Reaper, but it is close enough, and it is free. Just do BRD. You gotta do BRD anyway for Hand of Justice, right? So it's a really cool weapon. It is actually my favorite weapon in the game because I'm a weirdo, so you could go for that one too, pretty cool. So you can definitely take this one too. You can go for Nightfall, it's another blacksmithing weapon. It helps the raid, it has a debuff that gives spell damage for the raid, so that's pretty cool. You can do this one, it hits super hard. Of course that is not going to be available at launch. And eventually your goal as a two-hander warrior for access is gonna be to get the Spinal Reaper. That's gonna be a weapon from Ragnaros. It has 74 DPS, which is really freaking bonkers. The problem is it is way too fast, but it is still a huge upgrade, obviously, lots of DPS. So the Spinal Reaper should be your end goal if you are doing a two-hander build. That's gonna be in Ragnaros. If you are a human, there is not a lot of swords you can get early on, but there is a ton, and I mean a ton of maces that you can get. You can get the Sleeping Willow from the Beast, that's in Ubers, super easy to get. It also does AoE damage, which is kinda cool. You can make yourself a Hammer of the Titans with blacksmithing. It does a ton of damage, it is slow, and it has a stun for PvP, so it can also be really cool for that. You can also get a slightly weaker version of that in Stratholm, which is also really cool. It actually looks cooler, 52 DPS, so you can see it is not that behind all the other weapons. And if you're watching this when Alterac Valley is already out, you can, of course, one of the most iconic maces in the game, you can get the Unstoppable Force from Alterac Valley, the Reputation. You gotta get Exalted, but it is not that hard to grind Exalted, and it is an amazing weapon, 61 DPS. There are also a couple swords you can get. You can get the Relentless Sight, it's gonna drop from Ubers, actually no, from Lovers, the last boss in Lovers. And if you cannot do that, there is only 2 rare drops that you can rely on. And rely, of course, is a very air quotey kind of word here because you cannot rely on this at all. There is a less than 1% chance that you can get this epic sword from Baron Rivender in Stratholm. It does a ton of damage. Or you can get the Black Blade of Sharram. It drops from the last boss in Ubers. It has a proc to summon a ghost like lizard guy, and he helps you, and it does a lot of damage. So the proc is like the thing carrying this weapon. This is probably what I would consider the best in slot sword until you get the one in Molten Core. Of course, the one in Molten Core is gonna be Bone River's Edge. Bone River's Edge is gonna be definitely the best in slot for humans. Look at that, 75 freaking DPS, man. And it also ignores armor, so it scales very well. If you are not a human, however, you can take the Obsidian Edge Blade, and this will definitely be the best in slot for people that do not have a weapon racial. So if you do Molten Core and one of these swords drop, because they can drop from several bosses, as you can see, they can drop from Guard, they can drop from Magmadar, Geddon, and Golemag, you always get a small chance of finding this weapon if you do Molten Core, especially if you're like a new character in an established guild where everybody got their gear. You can probably get this weapon without any competition, and 8 sword skill, that's gonna be a free weapon racial, so if you're a Tauren, if you're a dwarf, this could be like a sign from God telling you to do two-hander if you get it. Honorable mentions for the people that do not have a weapon racial and still wanna do this anyway. You can get this polearm from Ubers, from Rend, and nobody wants it. It is kinda decent, it is not as bad as people like to say this. It is okay, you can do that, really easy to get. You can also get this polearm, it's a little better, from Dire Maul. Of course, Dire Maul is not available right now, but you can do it eventually. And if you want to be a complete douchebag and don't do what the system tells you to do because you're special and you're better than everybody, you can take a staff, okay? The Slave Driver's Cane from Ramstein in Stratholm. Nobody uses this weapon. It is slow, it has decent DPS, it has 29 strength. It is not a bad weapon. As crazy as it sounds, if you do not have a weapon, Rachel, you can go for this stuff. And that's hilarious. I would do it just to be hilarious about it. That's so fun. Imagine you show up to Molten Core with a stick. Yeah, I am so tempted to roll for this weapon right now, aren't I? But there you go, that's gonna be the 200 Fury build for you. You're gonna have a couple questions, so when should you do this build? Maybe you get a 200 weapon for free, maybe you get like a Black Blade of Sharram, or maybe the Bone River Edge or something like that drops in Molten Core and nobody wants it, and you should definitely do 200 if you get a significantly better weapon than your 100s, definitely, especially early on. If you are an orc, I think there is a great reason to be a 200 warrior early on, because there is not a lot of good access early on. There is a lot of good 200 access, but there is not a lot of good 100 access, so that's definitely something you can do. And overall, the main reason you should go 200 is because 200 works well when you do not have a lot of crit, and when you do not have a lot of attack power, you still are gonna do a lot of damage because your weapon has a lot of base damage, and you're gonna get scaling off of that a little more. So early on, 200 is gonna do more damage than dual wield. For how long? Almost nothing. For like a week, until you get like your real pre-vesting slot. That's when you get better than a 200 warrior. Usually that's when you outscale, assuming you get the same quality of weapon, because of course if you get a Bone River's Edge, the first Molten Core, and you get like blue swords as your dual wielders, of course 200 is gonna do more damage, but still, all things equal, the first week of Molten Core, it is definitely 200 weak. So do not feel ashamed. There is no shame in playing 200 Fury. It is not that bad as people like to say. It is still a really good spec. Subscribe, join the Discord, and thank you for watching.